This is the Zelda timeline, and this here is the Downfall timeline, everyone's favourite timeline in The Legend of Zelda. This timeline makes the most sense in the entire world. You see, in this one, the hero of time decides to kick the bucket because he's too weak. Absolutely pathetic! Even I could take down the magic pigman. Unfortunately, this was never shown in the game, so unfortunately this timeline has become extremely controversial. Since it was originally announced back in 2011, the hatreds towards this one timeline has slowly died down, as people have started emerging with theories that are trying to explain how exactly this timeline works. Luckily you won't be hearing me ramble on about that because I won't be covering that today. Instead, I will be covering whether Breath of the Wild fits nicely inside it. This is the third part of my big Breath of the Wild timeline series I started all the way back in July. I unfortunately decided I wouldn't do the final part back in July because I was kind of feeling burnt out from making these theories, as you know, I was doing them quite a bit, so yeah. Anyway, now that it's 2022 and it's been nearly a full year since I made my first theory video, I decided that it's finally the best time to talk about the Downfall timeline. In the previous two videos, I started by talking about references to the Downfall timeline on the Breath of the Wild map. As always, this will be the weakest set of evidence that I will provide in the video, as these are literally just references, they are nothing more, they're little Easter eggs. However, they do technically connect Breath of the Wild to the Downfall timeline, so I'm going to go through them anyway. Furthermore, I will be not including any references to areas set in different worlds or kingdoms, as these are definitely just Easter eggs. These include references to Koholint Island. Now that that's out of the way, let's start by looking at the map references. Unfortunately, I could only find 3. I've probably missed many more, but quite a large amount were references to the Dark World, Hyrule, or Koholint. The only references I could find are Aquan Bridge, which is a reference to Aquamentus, a Downfall timeline enemy, Digdog Bridge, which is a reference to Digdogger, another Downfall enemy, and finally Manhala Bridge, a reference to Manhandla. Now, you may be thinking that that's surely not all of the references. However, a large majority of the Downfall references are references to other places such as Koholint and the Dark World, so I couldn't include them. The reason for this is that most locations and things in the Downfall timeline have become staples of the series, for example Lake Hylia and Death Mountain. These are locations that are in pretty much every Zelda game, but they did originate in the Downfall timeline. This means that the majority of references has to be referencing things that are rarely found in most Zelda games, including every place and character on Koholint Island. Anyway, those were all the map references. Next, let's have a quick look at the species and races found across both Breath of the Wild and in the Downfall timeline. Just like the map references, we cannot use the existence of species as concrete evidence for Breath of the Wild being in the Downfall timeline, as there are species found in all 3 timelines. However, since some species in Breath of the Wild do technically link to the Downfall timeline, I'll quickly cover them here. The species that are exclusive to the Downfall timeline and are found in Breath of the Wild are the Lynel and the Hinox. The Hinox technically appears in Phantom Hourglass, however, that game was set in a parallel dream world, so their appearance doesn't disprove this conclusion. Apart from that one game, these enemies have never been found in a timeline outside of the Downfall timeline throughout the entire series, so that is why I've decided to bring it up here. However, like I said before, their appearance can't be used as solid evidence, as species that aren't found in the Downfall timeline can be found in Breath of the Wild, including the Rito and the Bokoblins. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was made to be a return to the original Zelda 1 formula, an open world game where you can go anywhere and run through each dungeon in any order. That was the whole design philosophy around the original Zelda. Breath of the Wild is very obviously inspired by it. For this section, I will go through a few things that inspired Breath of the Wild during its development. Firstly, when developing ideas for their physics engine, they used a smaller test game that was based off Zelda 1 to demo these ideas on. Next, The Guardians in Breath of the Wild were heavily inspired by an enemy found in Zelda 1, the Octorok. The developers originally designed the Octorok as large, dangerous, octopus-like creatures that towered over Link. The Guardians were based on these original interpretations, making them these large, terrifying beasts that towered over Link. Finally, even the story and setting of Breath of the Wild is heavily inspired by Zelda 1. In both games, a giant monster named Ganon invades Hyrule and completely takes over the kingdom. The world has few settlements left and is completely taken over by monsters. Princess Zelda is trapped in the final dungeon, and Link must defeat Ganon inside this dungeon. These are just a few of the examples of Zelda 1 inspiring Breath of the Wild. However, we'll be here all day if I go through them all, so I'm going to leave it here. Since Breath of the Wild is extremely inspired by the original Legend of Zelda, it could imply that there is a Downfall timeline connection, which is why I decided to cover it here. Well, that's about it for today's video. I know this wasn't as long as the other parts in this series, however, I feel like Breath of the Wild doesn't fit too well into the Downfall timeline. Sure, it is heavily inspired by the first game, but I believe that has nothing to do with the lore of Breath of the Wild, it's merely only how the game was developed. However, after looking through this today, I can still understand why some people might think that Breath of the Wild could be in the Downfall timeline. However, I personally just don't see it. I lean more towards the child and adult timeline personally, specifically the child timeline. However, that doesn't mean I'm correct. Until we hopefully get confirmation on the timeline placement of Breath of the Wild, this will remain a mystery and something that fans of this series will theorise over for years. I may return to this topic in the future once Breath of the Wild 2 releases. However, for now, I think I'm going to lay this to rest. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.